Good evening. Welcome to the Saturday Gala readings of the 2004 Montana Festival of the Book. I am Mark Scheraus, Executive Director of the Montana Committee for the Humanities, which sponsors this event, and through our grants and other programs, many other events like it throughout our state. The Montana Festival of the Book would not be possible without the assistance of numerous individuals and organizations. I would like to thank the more than 80 writers and panelists who appeared at this year's festival. Many have traveled great distances. All of them are here for their commitment to their craft and to their readers, and we sincerely appreciate their support for the festival. Foremost among the organizations that support us are, of course, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Montana Arts Council, the Paul G. Allen Family Foundations, the Charles Engelhard Foundation, and of course the Missoulian. Many other local individuals, merchants, and organizations listed on this evening's program support the festival in a variety of ways, and to them we also offer our thanks. And lastly, we thank readers like you who support the festival with your generous donations. We will thank you ever more if you make just one more stop by the donation box in the lobby this evening. I want to thank also the staff of the Montana Committee for the Humanities, Yvonne Gritzner and Gail Walton, and above all, our festival coordinator, Kim Anderson, for their great work in putting the festival together and keeping it running. Susan Carlson and Judy Klein help us immensely with the festival every year, and I'm grateful for their dedication and their hard work as well. A number of our wonderful volunteers do important work with the festival, and they also have our gratitude. One in particular, a fixture at this event the past 4 years, is not with us tonight, but I hope it's not too late to thank Bruce Lee, who supported so much Missoula and Montana culture. We remember you, Bruce. I have the honor of announcing tonight also the winner of this year's Happy Tales Literary Contest. The contest asks writers to supply happy endings to works in need of them. And in the past 4 years, we have worked diligently to improve on the writings of William Shakespeare, Ernest Hemingway, Norman Maclean, and Larry Watson. The winner receives both a modest stipend and the Nahum Tate Cup. Nahum Tate, as you all surely know, was the 18th century poet laureate who rewrote King Lear, and whose happy ending to the play was the version performed in the British Isles for the next 150 years. For 2004, the winner of the coveted, prestigious Nahum Tate Cup, drum roll please. That's good. It's Mr. Gordon Jameson of Albuquerque, New Mexico. For his imaginative, prize-winning parody of Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises. We'll have it up on the web in a few days. I need to thank also this year's contest judges, Professor Michael Sexton of Montana State University, and writer John Jackson of Missoula. And speaking of John Jackson, I want to convey also my appreciation to him and to photographer Tony Cesara for this year's Montana Festival of the Book poster. Tony's a great photographer, John is a great writer, and also a great sport. Among other announcements tonight, I have to tell you that you're on television, or you will be. Cable 7 is here filming this event. And the standard warning in this circumstance is that if you're sitting with someone that perhaps you don't want to be seen sitting next to, now would be a good time to move somewhere else. All three of tonight's gala readers will be available for signing and conversation in the theater lobby at the conclusion of this evening's readings. Their books will be on sale there also. And now it's my pleasure to present my colleague, our festival coordinator, Our Lady of the Books, Kim Anderson, who will introduce Mark Sprague. Thank you.
Hello, Missoula and beyond. It's wonderful to be standing here in front of you looking my best. I fell in love with Mark Sprague 5 years ago. And that was before I knew he had red hair, before I knew what an extremely charming man he is. I read Where Rivers Change Direction and fell in love with his voice. As many of you know, Mark is from Wyoming, born and bred, and still there, although he's spending a lot more time in Red Lodge, so now we try to claim him as our own. He published his amazing memoir, Where Rivers Change Direction, in 1999, and received the Mountains and Plains Booksellers Award for that book in 2000. He followed Where Rivers Change Direction with the acclaimed first novel, Fruit of Stone. And very quickly after that, published an even more highly acclaimed novel, An Unfinished Life, which was recently released. In a fairly unusual working method, Mark and his wife Virginia simultaneously worked on a screenplay version. Mark had been a screenwriter for quite a few years. The movie, directed by Lasse Hallström and starring Robert Redford, Morgan Freeman, and Jennifer Lopez, will be released early in 2005. If it's half as good as the book, it'll be a wonderful movie. In all of his work, for me, Mark talks about how very, very hard it is to be truly human. And for several hundred pages, he lets us live someone else's journey along that road. He lets us live someone else's struggles and victories. And that, too, is what I love about his work. It is my great honor to welcome onto our stage Mark Sprague.
Thanks to Kim for that very generous introduction. When you hear something like that, it makes you feel like you want to mount some sort of rebuttal, give you some sort of shameful confession that, as my brother-in-law once told me, that once I killed a gopher with a stick, something along those lines. I've been up here, I think, 4 years now. It's always felt like a privilege to me to be asked to participate in this festival. The warmth with which this community of accomplished writers, this community of careful readers has embraced my work has been for me an extraordinary gift. My thanks to Kim and Mark, to the Montana Committee for the Humanities and the Center for the Book. I'm also delighted tonight to be reading with Jim Burke and Chuck Palahniuk. On a panel this afternoon, David McCummer asked me to say a little bit about the genesis of this novel. In the other books that I started, I felt that I had some notion of the book I was going to try to render. This book happened in a completely different way, however. Its main character, a man whose name finally became Einar Gilkison, started showing up in my daydreams some years ago. I was working on another book, and I tried to ignore him. He was a very persistent man and started showing up in my night dreams. This book became his story. It became primarily a novel of forgiveness. Tonight, I'll read 3 short chapters. The first one will introduce you to Einar. It'll introduce you to his memory of his son Griffin, and briefly to a man named Mitch Bradley, with whom Einar has lived and worked a piece of land in Wyoming in this fictional town, or outside this fictional town of Issawa, for the past 50 years. It starts out in an outdoor sauna. I tell you that because my Finnish translator was so excited by this news that he emailed me half a dozen times It seems the last American novel that he had translated was one of Pynchon's, and there were no sonnets in it. So, from an unfinished life. The sapwood snaps, shifts in the low-bellied stove, and the heat swells up against the roof boards, and weathered fir planking, and the whole small building seems to groan. It's the first cool night of the fall. Good night for a sweat, and Einar adjusts his wet back and ass in the webbing of the lawn chair. He feels the full weight of his 70 years and wishes he thought to bring a towel to drape over the webbing, but he was in here just this spring, and he hadn't remembered one then either. He scoops a dipper of water from the pail beside the chair and casts it across the stovetop where it sizzles and steams. He wishes he would have known this was the way it was going to be. Some old son of a bitch should have explained getting old to me, he says aloud, and then bows his head against the wet pulse of heat. Hell, some old son of a bitch probably did, and I wasn't listening. The sweat drips from his nose and chin. He reaches his denim shirt from where he hung it on a nail, soaks it in the bucket, and then stands to wring it and mop his face and chest. He spreads the shirt over the chair and sits back down, staring at the chair that stands empty before him. Both chairs raised up on this platform into the heat. Through the west window, he watches the amber moonlight on the pasture and remembers the fall they skidded in the field stones and mortared them into the foundation under this board floor. The building was Griffin's idea. He'd said, "Dad, I need it. I really do." "You need a sauna?" Einard asked. "I'm a Viking," the boy said. "It's what the Vikings did." All of this 20 years ago. Mitch helping them frame the walls and the headers for the door and windows, and Griffin just a boy, but already used to working with the diligence of a man, and not a boy who'd ever asked for much. They put in a south-facing window, this one to the west, and a square of double-pane glass in the slanting roof so they could see the stars, and a smaller pane low in the east wall for the benefit of the boy's dog, so Carl could lie on the porch and stare in at them. When they were finished, Griffin took each man by a hand, standing between them, and bowed his head. "God bless this place," he said. He was serious, original. He wasn't just repeating something he'd heard. "Is there anything else you need?" Mitch had asked. The boy shaded his eyes, looking up at the man. "You could sit in here with us." Mitch's face shone even blacker in the sun, like wet obsidian. "Even though I'm no Viking." He bent down over the boy. "Even though my great-granddad was an African man." "I guess that means no," Griffin said. Mitch shoved him away playfully, the way men roughhouse with boys. "I guess I won't," he said. "I believe I've sweated enough in this life already." Einar smiles at the clarity of the memory. He works his jaw, and his ears pop as if he were descending from a great height, and the old dog fidgets on the porch, then settles its gray jowls on its crossed paws and stares in through the little window. His name's Carl, but it's not the original Carl. Just another dog taken from the town shelter, worked and fed and given a place to rest and grow lame. The first Carl lies buried behind the barn, dead and buried like his son Griffin and his wife Ella. He straightens in the chair and wonders if the dog wishes it had a boy for company. Not his boy, just some other kid. He wonders what it is that dogs long for, or if they long. Maybe they just wait patiently for some improvement in their lives. He thinks he's a man who knows something of waiting, but the heat's gotten to him and he feels his stomach come up and shorten his breath. He cracks a window and sucks at the draft of night air. He drops his head back and stares through the window in the roof. Pegasus has risen in the dark sky, poised as if for a run of magic, or that's what he used to think. Now he looks at the stars and sees only a silent, uncaring witness, and tonight feels this press of steam-thick heat, smells the odor of living wood reduced to ash. No magic. He pops a wooden match with his thumbnail and lights a candle on the shelf by his elbow. He shakes the match out, looks down at his shriveled thighs and worn knees. His legs are white as summer cloud, blue-veined. At least his arms and shoulders are still strong, and he tightens his chest, the muscles in his neck. To the empty chair he says, I've always been puny through the hindquarters, from the get-go. It's not news. He scoots forward on the chair and takes the quart mason jar from the shelf, holds it below him, and pisses it half full before setting it down by the water bucket. He thumbs the sweat from his eyebrows and blinks at the walls and shelves, at the fist-sized chunks of agate and quartz, the petrified wood, and half a dozen of the boy's favorite books. There's the huck feathers he'd hung on the walls, the skull of a black baldy bull, a map of Norway cut out of a National Geographic carefully with a razor blade, one of Iceland, and the picture of a bearded man in a horned helmet, and another of a tall black man with a spear balanced on a single leg, both from National Geographic, this Norseman and Senegalese hunter. The boy saw himself as dangerous, raised as he was by the descendants of warriors. Einar stares down at the dog again and thinks it'd be a fine thing to have that kind of focus, to have a small window with something to stare at on the other side. He wishes for his own window and wonders what he might see, and then wonders if Mitch has gone to sleep for the night. He pushes out of his chair and opens the door. He carries the jar at his side, steps to the edge of the porch boards and sloshes the piss out into the darkness. He stands steaming in the cool air. The dog shifts, but won't rise. Its hip so brittle with arthritis that it moves only when it must. Einar turns back to the doorway and says, isn't this just like old times? And the dog blinks its clouded eyes and yawns, and Einar thinks, this is an animal that should be called out into the tall weeds, shot in the head and buried next to its namesake. But he knows Mitch would never stand for it. Mitch believes in suffering as a right, a burden, even sacred for both man and beast. Einar and Mitch met in Korea. Mitch came back with Einar to work this piece of land with him. They've been together all that time. Mitch is a landless man. He was a man without family, a man who adopted Einar's family, felt the loss of Einar's wife, felt the loss of Einar's son. Einar's daughter-in-law, a woman named Jean, has returned to the ranch and brought with her her 10-year-old daughter and her personal sad story. So Mitch is understandably very excited to meet this little girl. He's assuming that she may become another part of family in his heart. He's asked Einar to ask the little girl, whose name is Griff, to bring him his lunch. So from further along in an unfinished life, this scene between Mitch and Griff. Mitch hears her steps on the porch boards. Here's her pause, here's her knock. You're going to have to let yourself in, he calls. There's another pause, longer this time. There's no doorknob. Her voice sounds puzzled, almost lost, and he thinks he should have remembered the door. He's allowed himself to get excited, and that's why he didn't. Pull the thong, he shouts, and wonders just how strange he'll seem to her. Certainly a sight more incomprehensible than a door without a knob. He's worried he'll frighten her, that his appearance might somehow damage the girl. He buttons his shirt at his throat and feels around the collar to make sure it's not crimped or that the points of the collar aren't sticking up. There's just a latch on the inside. The thong lifts the latch. The door swings open and Carl stands up wagging his tail. And Mitch tucks his feet back under his chair. He's gotten his boots on, but not laced, and doesn't want her to notice. She stands blinking in the doorway, letting her eyes adjust. She takes a step into the room, and he thinks this, like the latch string, is something else he should have considered. He's not prepared for how much she resembles her father. She has her father's chin, the same upswell on her lower lip. She holds her shoulders squared with her hips fallen back on her frame, just as Griffin faced the world. It's her father's body she's in, he thinks, her inheritance. My name's Griff Gilkinson. I'm over here, he says. She turns to the sound of his voice. The light from the open door falls across to where he sits on the far side of the table at the foot of the bed, shadowed. He's where he planned to be sitting, not wanting to be the first thing she saw. She walks out of the glare and stops, wincing at the sight of him as though she's been slapped. She stares down at the tray and he leans back in his chair. He saw the flash of panic in her eyes and imagines her counting the objects on the tray, the glasses, plates, the paper napkins, counting them twice, wishing there were more things to count. He asks, "Are you feeling dizzy?" She nods. She actually widens her stance as if she's afraid she might fall. "Why don't you slide the tray on the table if you think you're going to drop it?" She steps forward and sets the tray just on the table's edge, then folds her arms across her chest with her hands hidden under her arms. She tilts her head to sneak a better look. "I thought I might throw up the first time I had a look at it," he says. She nods with her head still tilted and clears her throat like an uncomfortable adult might. "I've puked lots of times," she says. "My mom says that's why I never stay sick very long. I get it out of my system." She clears her throat again but doesn't step away. The door's still open and she hasn't moved toward it. He'd hoped she'd be a brave girl, that she'd stand her ground. He thinks that's another aspect of her father she owns. When I was still in the hospital, he tells her, a nurse brought me a mirror after they took the bandages off. I got lightheaded and I couldn't look in a mirror, not again for a long while. He sets the plates on the table and props the tray up against the foot of the bed. He says, "There's 2 whole sandwiches here. One of them's mine," she says, and takes a deep breath, like she's been asked to swim the length of a pool underwater from one end to the other. She levels her head and makes her face appear like everything's just right. And he wonders how much practice she's had at it, how many times she's been required to stare at something horrible and act as though it's nothing at all. She takes another step toward the table and still hasn't looked away from him. "When the nurse brought you the mirror, did you puke then or were you just dizzy?" "I was just dizzy." He takes a bite of his sandwich. "The only time I ever threw up was when I saw a man eat a snail." She raises an eyebrow. "People don't eat snails." "Yeah, they do. I didn't believe it either till I saw it." He sips his milk and wipes his lip with the back of his hand, and when he doesn't say anything else, she slips into the chair where he put her plate. She's so slight, she doesn't have to pull the chair away from the table. She looks like she's still thinking about snails. She picks up her sandwich in both hands and stares right at him before she takes a bite. "Does it hurt a lot?" "No, it itches sometimes." He traces a finger over the slick pad of scar tissue on his cheek, the part that drags the corner of his mouth down. "I think," he says, "this part here sort of looks like a map of India." She takes another bite of her sandwich. She says, "I don't know what India looks like." And then, I'm sorry I talked with my mouth full." She holds a paper napkin in front of her mouth while she chews. After she swallows, she lowers it. "What happened to you?" I got mauled by a bear. A real bear. She can't hide the astonishment on her face. It wasn't the bear's fault. He was eating one of your granddad's calves, and we interrupted his dinner. We were kind of like uninvited guests. The dog circles and lies down again. She watches him until he's settled. Why didn't the bear bite Einer? I was closer, and I was out of the truck. She puts the sandwich back on her plate. But he saved you, right? Yeah, I did. He shot the bear. She nods and leans a little to the side, as though to look behind him, but he knows there's nothing there worth seeing. He turns his head, so she can see the whole side of his face, where his left ear should be. Her cheek ticks before she makes her face plain again. She touches her own ear. You're making up the part about the bear, right? Do I look made up to you? She shakes her head without seeming aware of it. May I touch it, she asks. He puts his sandwich down and pushes the plate away. He didn't think she'd be this brave, and he's not sure her father would have been. He says, no one's ever asked me that before. She slips out of the chair and stands by his side, raising a hand and then wiping it against her pants and raising it again. When he closes his eyes, he feels the small pad of a single finger move tenderly over the side of his face. She says, it's a lot smoother than I thought it would be. He opens his eyes when he hears her move. He watches her carry her sandwich to Carl and kneel down by the dog. She feeds him the meat, then sniffs the bread and lets him eat that too. The sandwich isn't very good, she says. Well, Einer's not much of a cook. She's still holding the napkin when she stands up, looking around the room. He doesn't realize she's looking for a trash can until she wads a napkin into her pants pocket. Then she steps to the workbench and bends over the antler clamped in the vise. These are little dogs, she says. They're wolves. She looks at him and then back at the antler. She nods, taking his word for it. Did you make this? I made all of them. She studies the antlers hung against the log walls, spinning slowly in a circle. Did you bury the bear? Your grandfather didn't kill the bear, he tells her. He just wounded it. She stares at the floor, perhaps thinking of how a bear might heal itself, then walks to the window and puts her hands up against the sill. He watches her study the mountains. Was it a mother bear, she asks. You mean, was it a bear trying to protect her cubs? She nods without turning. No, it wasn't. It was just an old fella. It was just an old bear was having trouble making a living. They don't usually come down this close to people. She turns. Then it doesn't happen all the time. I mean, you don't always have to watch where you go. No, he tells her. It happens sometimes in Yellowstone. Not for a long time here. My mom told me which way Yellowstone is, she says, and comes back to the table. Where'd you see the man eat the snail? In a restaurant in Denver. His left hand rests on the table in front of his plate, and she touches the back of it, skidding her finger toward his wrist to pull the creases away from his knuckles. Scar tissue just shows just under the cuff. And she touches there too, so lightly, he thinks, that if his eyes were closed, he could mistake it for a breeze, but his eyes aren't closed. And when she blinks, the light through the window flickers in her long lashes. She doesn't look up from his hand. Once, she says, I saw this kid eat a miller moth.
Thank you, Mark. Barbara Thoreau is a friend of writers, readers, librarians, indeed all who cherish books and their importance in our free society. Barbara is owner of Fact and Fiction Bookstore in Missoula, one of several local bookstores that generously support the Montana Festival of the Book. And she is among Western Montana's best known and respected civic and cultural leaders who honors us by serving on our festival steering committee. Please welcome Barbara Thoreau.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Missoula. It is indeed a pleasure to be a Missoula bookseller, and I have to tell you, in particular during the festival, because something magical happens during the festival, and I do need to take time to acknowledge the bookstore and the booksellers who work together. When I say something magical happens, there are 4 bookstores who for the past 3 years have been combining and collaborating to put together one festival store. These stores give up their corporate, institutional, and private identities to do this. We meet for several months beforehand. We meet with Kim and Mark in one of those neutral territories, i.e. the depot. But we've all come to know and respect and work together, and I would like to take the time tonight to acknowledge those booksellers. Stephanie, Barbara, and Mark from Barnes & Noble. Sarah and Keith from the University Bookstore. Garth from Shakespeare. And my backbone and my biggest support, David Johnson, Kyle McAfee, and Jason Thoreau from Fact and Fiction. And now for what I have been asked to do. It is always a pleasure to work with writers and people from across the country, and especially our Montana authors and our Missoula authors. And Fact and Fiction is 18 years old, and we have hosted 17 events with James Lee Burke. So I guess they figure I might know something about James Lee Burke. We have come a long way. It's been a pleasure to sell each and every one of the Dave Robichaux and Billy Bob Holland books. Jim has received 2 Edgar Awards, one in 1990 for Black Cherry Blues, which features Dave Robichaux, and one in 1998 for Cimarron Rose, featuring Billy Bob Holland. He has these 2 beloved characters, one that has sidelines and his own website. So now that Billy Bob Holland has moved to Missoula, I'm warning you, look for those sidelines and perhaps a website. Montana and Missoula has honored Jim, and we recognize Jim. Jim is a part of our community. He writes letters to the editor. He dedicates books to people we know. He does the call letters for Montana Public Radio. And Montana has recognized him. He's received the Governor's Arts Award for Literature. He, last spring, received the H.G. Merriam Award for Literature presented by the Friends of the Mansfield Library. And for several years has won the Independent's Best category for Favorite Local Author. So I was looking for something new. What could I tell you that was a little different about Jim? And I went to the magic world of the internet, to his publisher's website, where I found several letters from fans. And in case you think I'm making any of this up, it's at simonsays.com. I guess fans think they can maybe criticize and point out some facts or errors. This one, after In the Moon of the Red Ponies. Mr. Burke, I just started reading your book, only to chapter 4, and it already is hard to put down. That said, I would like to point out an error on page 24. Poor Ed T. Dumpter's hometown of New Baltimore, Michigan, is not on the shores of Lake Erie, but on the shores of a much smaller lake. Not an important mistake. You only missed it by 75 or 80 miles. Thank you. This one's from Harry in New Jersey. who didn't have spell check, I guess, on his email. "You books are the best I ever read. I can't wait until the next one is out. I get 'em quick, as my wife works in the library." A word of warning to those authors out there, the people also make some comments about the author photos. One about the belt buckle. "Would you please let me know where James Lee Burke purchased the Indian head belt buckle on the back cover of In the Moon of the Red Ponies?" And people take liberty with names. This one's message is addressed to Jamie Lee. "Jamie Lee, you're a good writer and I've read most of your works, but that picture of you on the back cover has got to go, old buddy. You and I'm 65 and we're just too old to wear jeans, but keep up the good work." And in keeping it fair and balanced, this one comes from Carol, saying she was commenting about some of his writing, and she adds, "I don't think you look bad in jeans," and then has her little smiley face that you create with the colon and the parentheses. "Not that your mode of dress is an issue." And two final ones that are from fans. This one from an avid fan. "I started reading JLB's books around 6 years ago and can say that I have yet to find any better. I just finished reading his book, White Doves at Morning. Any book that makes me stop and think, visually see and smell what has been put down on each line, can't get any better. He writes prose, but he's a poet. A reader can tell when an author writes his very best. Lastly, as long as he writes, I will read." And another one that's titled, or entitled, "The Impossible Prospect of Relaxation." "Dear Mr. Burke, why do I hate your work? Why am I squirming in my soft recliner as I churn through In the Moon of the Red Ponies? Because it's impossible to put it down and take even the smallest break. The tension is unbearable and the realism unsurpassed by any other author of my favorite genre. Reading is to be an escape. Reading your work is a hold your breath, can't take a bathroom break leap. Thank you for the thrills." Thank you, Jim. Let's give him a warm festival welcome.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And thanks, Barbara, for that fine introduction. And I'd also like to thank Mark and Kim for organizing the event tonight, and express my appreciation to the Montana Committee for the Humanities and the Center for the Book. Also, I'd like to thank all the great people of Missoula, Montana for being here tonight. Missoula is the best place on the planet, brother. This is it. And it's also an honor to read here tonight with writers of the stature of Mark and Chuck. This story is unread by anyone except me, and it's the editor at Southern Review. It's going to come out in the February issue of Southern Review, and I hope you enjoy it. It's titled, "Why Bugsy Siegel Was a Friend of Mine." And it's based on experiences out of my youth. My best and oldest friend was a fellow named Tom Crowder. He and I were inseparable when we were kids, and he passed away earlier in the year, and I wrote 3 stories about our childhood together, and this is one of them. In 1947, Nick Hauser and I had only 2 loves in this world, baseball and Cheerio yo-yo contest. That's how we met Benny one spring night after a doubleheader out at Buffalo Stadium on the Galveston Freeway. His brand new Ford convertible, a gleaming maroon job with the starch white top, white wall tires and blue dot tail lights, was stuck in a sodden field behind the bleachers. Benny was trying to lift the bumper while his girlfriend floored the accelerators, spinning the tires and blowing streams of muddy water and torn grass back in his face. He wore a checkered sports coat, lavender shirt, hand-painted necktie, and two-tone shoes, all of it now whipsawed with mud. But it was his eyes, not his clothes, that you remembered. They were a radiant blue and literally sparkled. "You punks want to earn $2 each," he said. "Who you calling a punk?" Nick asked. Before Benny could answer, his girlfriend shifted into reverse, caught traction, and backed over his foot. He hopped up and down, holding one shin, trying to bite down on his pain, his eyes lifted heavenward, his lips moving silently.